Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making it. We're about to get started in the next couple of minutes. Thank you. Oh, there's Dr. Barco. You remember? Yeah. Hey, Doc. So nice seeing you. Thank you so much for being here. Gonna talk some nitrogen. Super excited. Okay. Hopefully. Yeah, thank you for that reminder. Totally forgot to record your defense, so yeah, it's definitely not happening again. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Well, I can go sign here so that people can see me. Then
Oh, yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is great. It looks like a semester seminar, and it's summer. It's a full room here, so that's awesome. And we have a number of people online as well. So I welcome you here today to Eduardo's defense today for his PhD degree. Eduardo comes to us from Zamorano. He got his bachelor's degree in Zamorano. He is originally from Honduras, where Zamorano is. And he came to the States and had a master's degree at Mississippi State University, right? With Jack Barco. Some of you may know him. And then in 2020, with the middle of the pandemic, he moved to Minnesota and we received him with masks in our faces and he started working with us. And so today he will be talking about the project that he's been doing for the last several years. And one thing that I just want to bring up is his project is kind of a unique project and something that has been really valuable to a lot of people. This is a project that actually started before I even arrived to Minnesota. It started in 2011. There've been, 5 graduate students with Eduardo right now that have received their degrees. And the first student, John Ruben, was actually one of John Lamb's students. And when I arrived to the university here, John said, I have this project. If you want it, it's in your area, please take it. So I ran with it, and I've been running with it since that time. Annie Nelson was my first student here, and she did her master's in this location. It's a long-term project that we started back in 2011. Some things have changed, but the rotation continues to be the same. And the cool thing about this project, I think, is that it has allowed us to ask questions, find answers, and then, any good research project ends up with more questions. And so that's what we are doing, and we continue to do that. So Eduardo will be talking about some of the new questions that we are looking to address in this site. And then Jay Kastenbauer, he's here, right here. He's the next student that he's continuing to do some work on this project, kind of answering the next set of questions. So it's really just a wonderful opportunity to, of course, introduce you, Eduardo here, and also have this little background about the project, because it is kind of he continues the legacy of several of the other students that have been doing work in this project for a number of years. So with that, Eduardo, please take it away.
Well, let's see. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's definitely a great pleasure to be here with all of you. Well, it's incredible to see all of your faces as well. It's incredible to have kind of like this full house, if you might say. For sure, as Dr. Fernandez was saying, it's definitely incredible as well to kind of like stand in the shoulder of giants, as they say, with all the past research and the legacy that we've had in this project. So, you know, more importantly, I just want to start with a caveat of just thanking Dr. Fernandez as well for all of his continued support, mentorship, and as well friendship throughout these years, as well to every single one of you that are in here. I feel, to be honest and genuinely saying it, that this project is as much yours as it is mine as well. So with that being said, it's just a great pleasure for me to be able to share with you a little bit more of what I've been doing research-wise at the University of Minnesota during the last couple of years. So let's go ahead and have some fun talking about cover crops, shall we? So with that being said, the state of Minnesota has approximately 200,000 hectares of irrigated sandy soils that are predominantly under soybean and corn cultivation. These soils are highly important for the state's economy and for the global food supply of food fiber, feed, and fuel. As you can imagine, for sure, these are sandy soils, so just think about sands. So that means that they have a low water holding capacity and a high nitrate leaching potential. At the same time, throughout this time, we have realized that nitrogen-based management practices are crucial in order to manage these type of soils. However, they're not enough. As Dr. Fernandez was saying, previous studies have actually showed that whenever we have nitrate leaching losses within these vulnerable type of soils, we actually end up having most of the nitrate leaching losses earlier in the season. By that time, we don't even have a corn or a soybean crop established to actually take advantage of this nitrate. That is why cover crops actually offer a synergistic opportunity. As we know, cover crops are known to have multiple benefits, multiple agroecosystem benefits, all the way from nutrient retention to soil health, and actually even nitrogen supply from legumes via biological nitrogen fixation. As well, kind of like the staple cover crop species across the Midwest is annual rye. There are multiple reasons for this. Kind of like one of the big ones is the fact that it's winter hardy, so it's able to withstand the harsh winters that we have in Minnesota. And on top of everything as well, it allows an easy integration within corn and soybean systems. However, there are certain challenges, as everything, right? We have drawbacks, and the fact that, you know, we have a narrow planting window just after harvest actually limits the ability as well, or hinders the widespread adoption of this practice. In addition, we get some variable agronomic outcomes. Sometimes, for example, we hear about nitrogen mobilization actually causing yield penalties. That is why, kind of like starting to gain traction, we have Perennial CSb clover. In this case, it offers a novel alternative due to the fact that it has the same winter hardiness as rye. It has also a great spreading habit. It allows frequent defoliation, and on the other hand as well, it also allows for biological fixation and the supply of nitrogen. However, there's still a research gap. We're still trying to truly try to holistically understand kind of like the effect that these cover crops have, first of all, on nitrogen dynamics and how it actually impacts agronomic and environmental trade-offs, both within corn and soybean systems. Whenever we think about these vulnerable sandy soils, kind of like the major big deal we think is about nitrate leaching, right? And it actually makes sense, right? Like that has a lot of challenges, a lot of human concerns as well. For example, whenever the threshold over 10 milligrams of fluid per liter of nitrate concentrations are exceeded within groundwater, we might actually have serious health concerns. For instance, the lack of oxygen within baby's blood, or also known as blue baby syndrome. However, if we only evaluate this nitrate loss or this specific loss within the nitrogen cycle, we're just seeing the partial snapshot of the entire picture of a very dynamic cycle that we call the nitrogen cycle. That is why it is so important to also understand the other environmental losses. In this case, we might be thinking about, or there's an increasing concern for ammonia volatilization, just to the fact that agriculture is responsible for one of the major losses of volatilization, and this might also cause serious respiratory illnesses. In addition as well, we also have nitrous oxide emissions, that they have a global warming potential that is 273 times greater than that of carbon dioxide. Definitely very important, is one of the dominant ozone depleting substances in the 21st century, and is also considered the largest GHG from the US agriculture sector. Then furthermore, there's actually a lack of research within these type of systems that actually try to simultaneously evaluate these nitrate losses, well, these nitrogen losses, excuse me, simultaneously within corn and soybean systems. Then on the other hand, whenever we think about losses, the research out there usually tends to focus more on the corn phase, just because that's where we apply most or the grand majority of our nitrogen. However, the majority of corn soybean systems, or the corn grown within the Midwest region, is actually grown as a rotation. So we're just seeing a partial part of the picture, just knowing what's going on within the corn without having that much information about soybean. So that is why the objectives of this study are to determine the effects of 3 cover levels that included no cover, rye, and perennial Kura clover at different nitrogen rates in 3 cropping systems that included continuous corn, corn-soybean, and soybean-corn systems. And we're going to have kind of like, I'm going to walk you through kind of like 3 different focuses or foci of my research. First of all, kind of like talking about the agronomics, then second of all, focusing on the environmental part, and finally kind of like getting those head-to-head so that we know what are the trade-offs between one and the other. So this study was located in the central sands region of Minnesota, in west part of Minnesota. It was conducted from 2019, just after rye establishment, all the way to 2022. We had an urbilla sandy loam soil. As well, within these plots, we had access to an overhead sprinkler irrigation, a linear forward movement. And we also, one of the main mechanization, or the main mechanization practice, was via strip tillage. One of the reasons why we decided to go with strip tillage is because we needed to accommodate for the perennial Kura clover that was growing right in between the corn and the soybean systems, as you can see in the picture in here. So every time we think about Kura clover, let's think about this perennial system growing right in between of the corn and the soybean. For the experimental design, we had a randomized complete block design, 4 reps, kind of like the 3 cropping systems at the same time. We had 12 plots per replication, where we had 2-factor treatment allocation, kind of like the cover level, again, starting with no cover, rye, and Kura clover. We combined rye and no cover with 5 nitrogen rates that range from 0 to 300 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And we combined perennial Kura clover with 2 nitrogen rates, the 0 and the economic optimum nitrogen rate, which was established from prior research within this same study location. We had 3 split fertilization events following nitrogen best management practices according to the extension guidelines of the University of Minnesota, where we applied at V2, V6, and V10, 25, 25, and 50% of the total nitrogen requirements. For the fertilizer source, we used urea with an urease inhibitor, in this case using agrotine. So this is kind of like the spatial allocation to give you a better idea of how my project looked in both years. So you can see, kind of like an important thing is that we have the 3 cropping systems growing side by side in each one of the years. As well, you can see kind of like the structure of the replications within these systems. And then on the other hand, you can see kind of like the 2-factor treatment allocation, the cover levels, as well combined with the different nitrogen rates. So for sampling, in terms of agronomics per se, we collected biomass samples just prior terminating the rye. We collected for both, for Kura clover as well as for rye. For corn and soybean, we collected whole plant samples whenever we reached physiological maturity, as well as collecting or harvesting using a 2-plot combine in this case in order to calculate our yields. All of these plant samples were dried, were ground, and were analyzed for total nitrogen using dry combustion. Kind of like for the season-long evaluation of nitrate and ammonium, we used plant root simulator probes. So for those of you that are not familiar with these type of probes, you can see them in here in this picture. And these probes actually have these really cool 10 centimeters square resin that actually emulates what the root is doing within the soil. Therefore, we're able to quantify kind of like the nitrogen availability throughout the entire growing season, both for nitrate and as well for ammonium levels. We also did 2 separate analyses. One was, or 2 separate samplings. One was trying to isolate the impact just from the supply of the soil per se from nitrogen by isolating, in this case, with this inclusion brings the PRS probes. And we also had a bioavailable fraction where the probes were installed directly into the soil. We also installed capacitance sensors to monitor soil moisture and temperature at different depths in the soil. And we also collected soil sampling just after harvest to determine soil total inorganic nitrogen. For the environmental sampling, we installed 3 permanently suction tube lysimeters that were installed just right below the read zone. They were installed in 8 out of the 12 replications from each of the reps. And then as well, this nitrate concentration, the average of the 3 suction tube lysimeters were calculated in order to get the average representation of nitrate concentration for a treatment. And this was multiplied with drainage in order to calculate the loading. Kind of like very briefly, just for you to know, and this is just kind of like to give a caveat, just because in Minnesota, whenever we think about drainage, we're used to thinking about tile drainage or other direct form of drainage. In this case, the drainage was actually calculated using the water balance equation. This equation, in essence, what it does is that it calculates all the water inputs that we have within a system, meaning mainly precipitation and irrigation, as well as the change in soil volumetric water content and all the outputs that we have in the system. In this case, runoff is considered negligible because we have a sandy soil, so we have rapid infiltration, and also we had a slope that was lower than 1%. For crop evapotranspiration, kind of like the important caveat that you need to know is that in this case, the crop coefficients, they still have not been developed for Kura clover. Therefore, I used alfalfa in order to model for the water dynamics of Kura clover. In this case, as it has been done in prior research within the Midwest. Then on the other hand as well, to calculate the water dynamics within the Kura integrated systems, I used a continuous intercropping method with similar ground cover. For the gaseous losses, we used acid trap samples where we collected ammonia volatilization emissions 1, 4, 7, 14, 21, and 28 days after planting and after each one of the fertilization events. For the nitrous oxide emissions, we used an automated gas analyzer in order to collect nitrous oxide emissions 3 times a week throughout the entire growing season. Very briefly as well, I also did a nitrogen balance. The overall goal of this was to try to quantify what's the balance of the nitrogen dynamics that are going on within the systems. So we had all the specific inputs throughout the season, which in this case, it's the fertilizer or the biological nitrogen fixation in the case of soybean systems. And we discounted all of the outputs as well as the change in soil total inorganic nitrogen. For statistical analysis, I analyzed all of my data using the SAS software. In this case, I fitted a mixed model considering cover and nitrogen rate as the main effects and block considered as the random effect. All of these data sets were evaluated for normality and also as well as the residual plots in order to conduct an analysis of variance using a threshold significance level of 0.10. As well for the PRS probes, I did a repeated measure analysis where I chose as the covariance structure the autoregressive model of order 1, which was chosen based on AIC and BIC criterions. So before actually going to the results section, this is kind of like a couple of like caveats or important notes so that you can follow along as we start evaluating the results of this experiment. Kind of like one really important one is the fact that as you start seeing the graphs and the different tables, every time that I refer to the cropping systems, you will see that continuous corn, corn-soybean, and soybean-corn will be referred using these acronyms that you see bolded in here. As well, one of the important kind of like clarifications is that continuous corn, pretty self-explanatory, meant that corn was present each year. Corn-soybean meant that corn was present that particular year, and soybean meant that soybean-corn meant that soybean was present that particular year. As well, in terms of simplicity and as a result of our preliminary analysis, all of the data will be presented just comparing the 3 cover levels, the no cover, the rye, and the Kura for 2 nitrogen rates, which included the 0 for each one of them, as well as the economic optimum nitrogen rate. And again, just a quick caveat, every time we think about the EONR that was previously established, for continuous corn, let's think 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And for corn soybean, let's think 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So diving into the good stuff, as they say, into the results. First of all, let's start about, kind of like understanding what happened agronomically within these systems. So I think that before actually going into the agronomic results, one really good clarification is kind of like understanding the different precipitation and the variable precipitation variability that we had within this study. We had 2 contrasting precipitation patterns. So kind of like to set up this graph for you, here in the bars, you can see in blue the irrigation events that we had throughout the season. In black on the bars, you can see the actual precipitation events. The lines, the purple one actually indicates the cumulative precipitation and irrigation. and the blue one indicates just accumulated precipitation. So we can see kind of like some commonalities between both seasons. Kind of like the first season, you can see that both years had an early wet spring, particularly around April. However, the first season after that, we had consistently dry conditions. As you can see, we tried to mitigate this by providing irrigation to kind of like get up to par to the overall 30-year average. However, despite of the fact that we're doing everything correctly, providing irrigation, we then get all of a sudden in August, within a period of 10 days, all of a sudden 170 millimeters of precipitation that actually throws everything off and literally ends up resulting in greater water inputs that we were intending. Then on the other hand, for sure, we had kind of like that early wet spring where most of the precipitation occurred. And after that, we had drier conditions throughout the rest of the season. Kind of like overall, one of the big takeaways of what I'm trying to explain here is that that's a really great challenge of actually doing not only field research, but actually just overall field operations. Just because, we might be doing everything by the book, following the best management practices, in this case for irrigation, but still the great variability that we cannot predict for might actually end up throwing away all of our efforts and result in greater water inputs. Overall, this is important because it ends up impacting both the agronomic performance as well as the environmental impact, as we will see in the other results. So moving along, kind of like talking about the biomass specifically, one of the greater trends that we were able to see in here is the fact that overall, one of the major drivers for cover crop residue accumulation was the prior crop residue. And this hypothesis is actually based on the fact, if you follow with me, you can see that corn-soybean for both rye and Kura clover actually ended up resulting in greater biomass accumulation compared to continuous corn and soybean corn. As a matter of fact, there was 3 times greater accumulation in corn-soybean compared to continuous corn and soybean corn. So what that is telling us, think about the corn-soybean system. The residue that is present within this system is from soybean. Soybean tends to have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, decomposes faster, and therefore ends up resulting in less of a barrier for adequate cover crop biomass development. As well, on the other hand, kind of like these same biomass distributions that we are seeing in here, we're actually seeing as well for the nitrogen content within the cover crops. Then on the other hand, on 2022, it's really interesting to see that there were no significant differences. And if you bear with me, I'm actually going to explain you why. So despite of the fact that in an effort actually of trying to improve overall cover crop growth and development, and after 10 years of consecutively using these systems, we ended up deciding to actually do a crop residue baling by the end of the season. So overall, this actually helps to explain and supports the hypothesis that by removing that constraint for adequate cover crop growth and development, we get an improvement in that consecutive spring. For sure, I am not claiming causation just because I know that this was not part of the original experimental design, but it definitely helps to support the theory of what we observed on the first year of the experiment. Kind of like shifting gears in here, trying to understand what happened in the actual crop performance. So first of all, let me set up this graph for you. Overall, you're going to see a side-by-side comparison of continuous corn, soybean, and soybean corn for both years of the experiment. So overall, kind of like one of the striking things that we were able to see is that no cover had the same grain yield performance as rye. Overall, this might be pretty good, right? Because literature actually says that there's a lot of rice systems out there that actually end up resulting in a yield penalty. But in this case, we actually had the same yield performance as no cover crop. However, this was the contrary case for Kura clover. For Kura clover, whenever we evaluate the corn-soybean rotation, we're able to see a yield decrease of 30% and 20% in corn-soybean and in soybean corn. Overall, as well, it was interesting to see that in the first year of the experiment, soybean corn actually did not result in a yield penalty. But I will show you as well why did this actually happen and why Kura clover did not affect soybean on the first year. Then whenever we evaluate continuous corn, it actually gets really interesting because on the first year of the study, we were able to see that there were no significant differences between the covers, meaning that Kura clover actually yielded the same as rye and no cover. Towards the second year of the experiment, there were significant differences, but these only happened at that EONR rate. So that actually is telling us a whole bunch, especially because when we compare, there is a consistency that at the zero nitrogen rate, actually Kura clover is able to result in the same yields as no cover and rye. So that is telling us a whole bunch. That is telling us that probably by fine-tuning the nitrogen management practices, we might be able to achieve consistent yields on a year-to-year basis by using Cura clover. Then kind of like just doing one snapshot evaluation in here, I'm just presenting the continuous corn for nitrogen uptake. Given that overall there was the same dynamics observed in grain yield were observed in nitrogen uptake, the only exception happened for continuous corn, and that's why I decided to present this one. Overall, it was actually fascinating to see that despite of the fact that we saw those dynamics in grain yield, whenever we evaluated nitrogen uptake, actually Cura clover was able to consistently result in the same nitrogen uptake compared to no cover at both nitrogen rates on both years of the study. And that is pretty huge, because what that is telling us is that we are actually able to implement Cura clover without compromising plant nutrition in corn systems. Talking a little bit more, but then, I want us to think a little bit more deeper about this, especially when we think about that yield penalty that we observed on corn soybean. So for example, this is a side-by-side comparison, kind of like doing Cura clover side-by-side to continuous corn. You can see in yellow Cura clover in each year of the study at each of the nitrogen rates compared to Cura clover with corn soybean, which is the red graph. In this case, it's really interesting. And what I want us to think about is reflecting on the fact that at the end of the day, Cura clover in corn soybean ended up having a similar or higher grain yield than Cura clover in continuous corn systems. And even better, we were actually able to achieve this by using 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare less within corn soybean systems. So again, maybe it's just a matter of perspective. Yes, it's true, it's a yield penalty. We don't want to tell our farmers they're going to have a yield penalty, but maybe we're looking at this wrong. Maybe it's just a matter of perspective against what we are comparing to. What is the baseline that we're actually using to compare things with? So the PRS probe data actually help explain a lot of these agronomic dynamics that we were seeing. Kind of like one of the two main takeaways that we're able to see from the PRS probe data. First of all, is that the ammonium levels were low throughout the majority of the season. And actually, as a matter of fact, they were non-detectable. So overall, this is telling us something big, and is that nitrification was prevalent throughout the majority of the season. Second of all, as well, we were able to see that there were no differences between the supply and the bioavailable fractions. That is why all my PRS probe data will be presented for the bioavailable fraction. Then on the other hand as well, I am highlighting in red, kind of like in here, just because continuous corn, kind of like comparing again side by side, continuous corn, corn soybean, and soybean corn, was the only one whenever I did the repeated measure analysis that did not show a cover times timing interaction. And that is telling us a lot, because overall, Cura clover actually showed a decrease of 40 and 34% less nitrate at the EONR compared to no cover and rye. And this is a pretty big deal, because if we are able to actually, have a consistent yield compared to no cover and rye, that means that we can actually, provide similar levels of agronomic performance while potentially resulting in lower nitrate levels, which that might result in lower environmental impact, as we will see in the environmental impact section. As well, kind of like helping us explain things agronomically, we were able to see that at the 0 nitrogen rate, there were no significant differences. So again, kind of like really nailing down the concept that, hey, maybe we might be able to make Cura clover work within continuous corn systems, but it might just be a matter of fine-tuning the nitrogen management practice. So whenever I did the repeated measure analysis, let me set up things for you in here. So overall, on the top two graphs, we're seeing corn-soybean rotations for both years of the experiment. This is the cover times timing interaction, meaning that it is average across both of the nitrogen rates. On the bottom, we can see for both years of the experiment, the soybean corn systems. So overall, this is telling us kind of like these graphs tells us some pretty important information. And one of the major takeaways is that only significant differences were only found on the very early season stages of crop development, actually all the way till the B6 development for corn. So that is big, because in the case of corn soybean, that actually shows us that Cura clover results in lower nitrate levels. That is telling us a whole bunch and things that we can actually improve via management. For example, in these very early stages, that ends up causing the yield penalty, because throughout these early stages in the prior year, we had a soybean crop. The soybean crop, again, provides nitrogen credits, or that's what usually farmers go to whenever they do the corn-soybean rotation. So Cura clover ends up uptaking most of that nitrogen and ends up causing that marked yield penalty. For soybean corn, on the other hand, we're able to see that whenever we didn't have that competition from Cura clover, kind of like the yellow line in here, that actually ended up resulting in no significant differences, as we saw in the first year of the experiment. However, whenever we saw that earlier on competition, that is when we end up causing that yield penalty. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the soybean plant, as it is developing early in the season, it's still not peaking in biological fixation. Therefore, it depends more on the nitrogen that is available in the soil. And if the Cura clover is uptaking this, that ends up causing the yield penalty that we saw in corn, soybean, and soybean corn systems. Kind of like shifting gears in here to evaluate the nitrogen rate times timing interaction. So this is average across covers. Here I'm selectively choosing just to present the continuous corn data, just because the same behavior was observed for the corn soybean systems. So we're able to see overall, first of all, you see kind of like the solid line in here represents the fertilized rate. The dashed line represents the zero nitrogen rate. So right off the bat, you're able to see kind of like the effect of nitrogen fertilizer within the systems. As well, you can see kind of like the three split fertilizations event and how that causes an increase within the system. But more importantly, one of the big things that this data is telling us is that around the R3 stage of corn, around the PRS timing 4, we actually observed consistently a peak in nitrate availability. And there's two sides of the coin, right, as everything. So kind of like one side could be that maybe, having greater availability later in the season might be a good thing. At this stage, the corn plant is in R3, so it's still taking substantial amounts of nitrogen. So it might be a really good thing. However, if you recall kind of like the precipitation patterns that we had, if that is combined with a lot of precipitation throughout that time, as Dr. Fernandez likes to say, just the wrong person at the wrong time, and literally it results in lots of nitrogen losses. Now, shifting gears a little bit more into the environmental impact results. So first of all, starting kind of like with nitrate concentration, kind of like one of the big deals that you need to kind of like notice about this data overall is that, overall, there were no significant differences, or it was really hard to see significant differences by cover. Actually, kind of like the main driver was nitrogen fertilization, meaning that whenever we applied nitrogen, we expected an increase in nitrate concentrations, and that's what happened. As well, it also highlights the overall fact that it's really challenging to achieve the actual safe water drinking standards from the EPA of 10 milligrams per liter, as even with applying cover crops, overall, it's really hard to actually go below that threshold. For sure, water from agricultural activity is not used for drinking actual human consumption, but for sure, this exemplifies actually kind of like a really good case study of what might happen in other vulnerable soils that actually have access to this type of water. Now, where things get really interesting, and again, let me kind of like set things up for you. You have kind of like a side-by-side comparison of the three cropping systems. As well, you have kind of like the three cover crops overall. So when things get really interesting, is when you consider the drainage factor as well, because that's when we're able to see differences by the nitrate leaching loads. Overall, we're able to see, for instance, that rye ended up resulting in the same nitrate leaching than no cover. So if you recall, yes, it's pretty great. We don't have a yield penalty. No cover and rye resulted in the same agronomic performance, but it's also not providing us anything environmentally, and that might be a really huge deal. However, when we talk about Cura clover, it did a fantastic job at reducing nitrate leaching losses. It actually reduced at the UNR in continuous corn leaching losses by 44%. Within both years, and it also reduced leaching losses in corn, soybean, and soybean corn by 45 and 39%. Also, one of the really cool things about this experiment is that, again, by having the full rotation, we're able to compare it with the continuous corn system. It was really interesting to see that the overall value of the full rotation, meaning a full year of corn and soybean, actually ended up resulting in 35% more nitrate leaching than continuous corn. This is kind of like showing the distribution throughout the season. So again, let me set things up for you. You have on the top three graphs kind of like the three cropping systems overall for the first year, as well as the three cropping systems for the second year of the experiment. Overall, you're able to see here as well, kind of like in maroon arrows, kind of like showing the different nitrogen fertilization events for both years. So already, kind of like just visually observing all of these graphs, you can already tell that, it's telling us something really big. And it's the fact that despite of the fact of even using nitrogen best management practices, actually most of the losses were not driven by the actual fertilization timing, but they were driven actually by the precipitation events that we had within the systems, which that's something pretty huge, because at the end of the day, we are really not able to control precipitation events. That's completely out of our hands. And more importantly, that shows, if you can see the yellow lines throughout the entire graph, those represent CURA clover. So basically, that's telling us that CURA clover is one of the best insurance policies that we can have, because regardless of the precipitation events that we have, regardless of the variability, we're always going to have an additional cover crop, an additional cover in there that is going to uptake extra nitrate and going to reduce nitrate leaching losses. And overall, again, kind of like just, talking about the precipitation events, again, you can see kind of like the peaks on the first season, kind of like with all the precipitation later on, versus the second year as well, where you saw more of the losses on the beginning part of the season. So then doing kind of like a deeper dive, just to, again, something that I thought was fascinating whenever evaluating the soybean corn rotation. So you would think, soybean corn, we're not using nitrogen fertilizer, right? So we might not even get that much nitrate leaching. But as a matter of fact, with my data, I was really surprised to see that despite of the fact that, again, no nitrogen fertilizer is being used within these systems, it actually resulted in a high loss of nitrate. As a matter of fact, the leaching losses were 1.5 times more or greater than both corn systems. In addition as well, I was able to see that whenever the corn was fertilized, kind of like you can see these top graphs, on the prior year, meaning on the corn phase, it actually increased leaching losses. And then on the other hand, it also showed something really important for soybean corn. So on the first year, you can see again, most of the losses occurring in August, just because we had all of that precipitation, all that water coming into the system. But in the second year, actually, when we had most of our losses at the beginning, because that's when we had most of our water inputs, we were still able to observe that from August all the way to October, we had 53% of the nitrate leaching losses within soybean systems. And this is actually something that has to do with the nature of soybean systems. Overall, you compare side by side soybean versus corn systems, soybean is going to mature earlier, and therefore is going to stop depending on that nitrate from the soil earlier in the season. In addition, as well, that also means that whenever we are aiming to mitigate the nitrate leaching losses in these corn-soybean systems, again, we need to think about the full and the entire rotation, because soybean systems might also result in great and impactful environmental losses. So kind of like transitioning to gaseous losses in here, kind of like setting up the graph for you. Again, we have kind of like side-by-side comparison of the three cropping systems. Again, continuous corn, corn-soybean, and soybean-corn for both years of the experiment. Right off the bat, one of the really interesting things is that we did not see an effect from nitrogen fertilizer overall, meaning that only cover crops were the main key drivers towards ammonia volatilization. More importantly, we're able to see that in continuous corn systems as well, there were no significant differences. And probably, one of the reasons of this is because in continuous corn systems, we get more carbon to nitrogen ratio from the residue, therefore promoting more immobilization and resulting in kind of like a masking effect that doesn't allow us to see an effect of ammonia volatilization, especially when comparing cover systems. However, for corn, soybean, and soybean corn, we were able to see overall that CURA clover, kind of like as a trade-off, ended up increasing ammonia volatilization losses in corn, soybean, and soybean corn by 22% across both years. And again, right, this might be a trade-off, you might think, but whenever we think about nitrate leaching losses, the magnitude of those losses are way larger than whenever we compare it to the lower magnitude of ammonia volatilization losses. So yes, it's a trade-off, but we always got to keep in mind the magnitude of these losses. Explaining a little bit more about the science of how the CURA clover actually ended up increasing ammonia volatilization. So setting up this graph for you, you can kind of like see the three cover systems, kind of like CURA clover, no cover, and rye, as well as you can see the different fertilization events at V2, V6, and also V10. Kind of like the important thing in here is that we suppress CURA clover around V6. And yes, it's true, right? Like we're not aiming to kill or to terminate completely this cover crop because it's a perennial system. But for sure, whenever we apply herbicide, we're naturally going to have some natural senescence of plant tissue. For sure, whenever this plant tissue starts to senesce, and we start getting around July when temperatures are warmer, when there is sufficient moisture and irrigation as well, we get an accelerated CURA residue decomposition, which actually ends up increasing ammonium availability in the soil. And this ammonium availability temporarily increases ammonia volatilization losses. So as you can see, most of the patterns when most of the losses actually occurred. You can see the fluxes in here are actually the same. And these losses, these bursts or increases in ammonia volatilization actually occur in very isolated events that end up driving those cumulative ammonia volatilization losses. Now, finally, for the environmental losses, we as well were able to see, I was able to see overall that only nitrogen rate ended up affecting nitrous oxide emissions, which can actually be a pretty big deal. Because if we think again about magnitude, Cura clover potentially is, reducing the leaching losses that we have within the systems. We might get a trade-off in corn-soybean and soybean-corn, but again, it's all about the magnitude. And when we think about this major gaseous loss impacting the atmosphere and as well that can have incredible environmental impact longer term, we're actually not increasing nitrous oxide emissions. So this is actually great news despite of the fact that we did not find significant differences. Kind of like tying everything together, kind of like in the nitrogen balance, again, just trying to understand all the outputs that we had in the system versus all the inputs that we had in the system. So the zero in here, kind of like the dotted line, defines that everything above it is a positive nitrogen balance. Everything under it is a negative nitrogen balance. So overall, one of the pretty big deals that we're able to see Cura clover, again, kind of like in yellow, is that Cura clover was actually able to increase the nitrogen balance by 87 and by 71 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in continuous corn and in corn-soybean systems. In additionally, as well, despite of the fact that soybean corn, yes, it's true, it resulted in negative nitrogen balance values. And a lot of this is because of the fact that soybean is not able to replenish the soil from the nitrogen that it's actually extracting, again, because we don't have that nitrogen fertilizer addition. But despite of that, we still were able to see the same tendency of Cura clover towards resulting in less negative values compared to no cover and to rice systems as well. Kind of like the key drivers in here for us to think about this nitrogen balance, kind of like one really big one is just the fact that overall Cura clover, as I discussed, it reduced nitrogen leaching losses. At the end of the day, nitrogen leaching losses were about 96% of the total nitrogen losses that we had in these systems. Therefore, that ended up causing these positive balances or these less negative balances as well within these systems. Then on the other hand, yes, it's true, we had lower grain nitrogen removal, which was more true for corn, soybean, and soybean-corn systems, as we discussed that there were no differences with continuous corn. And in addition as well, Cura clover actually was the only one that resulted in a negative soil total inorganic nitrogen change between the beginning and the end of the study. So that's actually a perfect segue because it talks about the fact that maybe all of this nitrogen retention that we have within the systems, and we have these rapidly available inorganic form of nitrogen, it might actually get transformed into longer, more stable organic forms of nitrogen that end up benefiting the overall agroecosystem resilience and soil health of these systems. So kind of like big takeaway in here, kind of like putting everything together side by side, doing, kind of like the drum roll moment, if you might say, kind of like comparing what this meant in terms of agronomics versus the environmental impact. This is kind of like a side-by-side comparison for the three systems, continuous corn, soybean, and soybean corn as well. So a pretty big deal, right? And this is all compared towards the baseline or the traditional no cover crop management system. So yes, for rye, we were able to see that there were no differences agronomically with no cover across the three cropping system. Pretty good, right? Like we're not causing a yield penalty. But whenever we evaluate the environmental impact that rye cover crops had, we actually ended up seeing that rye cover crop actually doesn't give us any additional environmental benefit. So the actual fact of going out there, planting a cover crop, yes, it might not hurt our yields, but at the same time, we're still leaving unchecked an important environmental impact by using these cover crop. However, with Cura clover overall, we're able to see that it was system dependent. Overall, if we see for corn, soybean, and soybean corn, we're able to see kind of like for the agronomic responses that for sure we had that yield penalty for both systems. However, whenever we talk about the environmental impact, we're able to see that Cura clover has a great reduction in terms of nitrate leaching reduction. Yes, it might have some trade-offs, kind of like increasing ammonia volatilization, but again, let's think about the magnitude. And then on the other hand, it also had a negligible effect in terms of nitrous oxide emissions, which is a pretty great win. Now, on the other hand, kind of like leaving the best for last, kind of like in this lower quadrant, we're able to see that Cura clover in continuous corn systems in terms of agronomics, was actually able to deliver similar nitrogen uptake levels as no-cover systems, as well as similar yield responses as no-cover crop systems. For sure, assuring the consistency of these responses throughout longer-term experimentation is going to be critical in order to facilitate widespread adoption of these practices. But whenever we evaluate that in contrast towards the CURA environmental impact in continuous corn systems, we're able to see that it decreased nitrate leaching, and it also had a negligible impact in terms of ammonia volatilization and nitrous oxide emissions, meaning that this is a win-win that allows agricultural sustainability while also reducing the environmental impact within this system. So kind of like to wrap things up in here, we were able to see throughout this really intense discussion of nitrogen dynamics, for sure, all of the complex interactions that cover crop integration actually mean, things that we have to consider all the way from crop rotation, weather variability, water dynamics, and also the nitrogen management itself. Also, agronomic and environmental trade-offs were system-dependent, challenging one-size-fits-all solutions for cover crop recommendations, particularly whenever we think about CURA clover systems. More importantly, perennial CURA clover was an effective tool for addressing nitrate leaching, which was the dominant nitrogen loss pathway in sandy soils across cropping systems. And finally, Wright delivered minimal agronomic, but it also delivered minimal environmental benefits. And on the other hand, I think that even more importantly, this leads us to challenge the current status quo, where rye is the default cover crop in similar production systems across the Midwest. And finally, CURA clover and continuous corn offer a promising synergistic strategy which can optimize agronomic performance while also optimizing and mitigating the environmental impact. With that being said, I would like to send in a special shout out and a big thank you to all of the generous funders that actually made possible pursuing a research like this one from this magnitude, and also more importantly, that allowed me to pursue a PhD degree here at the University of Minnesota, and as well to every single one of the collaborators out there that made pursuing and actually doing this project a reality. Finally, although I think that I wish that I would have an entire presentation just dedicated to all the people that actually supported me throughout the way, for sure, I think that I already did one presentation for today. I think that's everything I have for you today. But still, kind of like I shared a lot of research findings today, but I think that probably, throughout this process, I realized about another more important finding, and this is more at a personal level. And it's the fact that it doesn't matter what you're doing in life, doesn't matter what you're trying to pursue in life. At the end of the day, the people that you have around actually make a big difference, and that's what it makes actually this a ride worth living. With that being said, I'm really thankful with all the people that actually have made this a ride worth living for me. As I like to say, kind of like bringing me all the way from the Honduran tropics all the way to the Minnesota tundra. It has been definitely a great pleasure. And with that, I would love to leave the floor open for any questions. Thank you very much.
Question for Eduardo.
Let me see the chat as well. Yeah. Yeah.
This presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Right. Well, you have a question about the cover crops.
Yeah.
So your clover is a legume. So
Yes.
it's going to be fixing nitrogen.
Yes.
Is that accounted for in your budget somehow? How did you,
Yeah, that's a great question as well, and kind of like repeating it as well for the chat, for the Zoom meeting that we have. Overall, the question was that CURA clover, it's a legume, and if that was accounted for in the nitrogen balance, right? So overall, the response is yes. As a matter of fact, we know that there is kind of like an activity from biological fixation from CURA clover. We did not account it into the nitrogen budget itself, just because in order to actually achieve that, we would have needed additional sampling throughout the season to adequately be able to capture that. And actually, that's an excellent segue as we were talking, right? That's the next step of the project. Actually, my colleague here and dear friend as well, Jake, is actually researching that, using N15 as well in order to really know where all the nitrogen is going with more accuracy than ever. Yes.
What was the VNF part of your nitrogen budget?
Yeah. Oh, so for CURA clover, yeah. So
Not necessarily for cured clover, I just noticed.
Oh, for soybean, yeah,
For
yeah,
bean- Oh, for soybean.
yes, yeah, yeah. So kind of like just repeating, yeah. Just repeating for the Zoom chat as well. Just kind of like that biological nitrogen fixation was accounted for soybean systems. And yes, Emerson,
Congratulations for presentation.
thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you, as you follow your presentation, you haven't included here as a fixed effect on your stats. So it was not included.
Yeah,
That side. And I'm curious because like
Yeah.
I saw a dry spring and a wet spring.
Yeah.
And in both years, like you have a trend of high nitrate, like after in V10. So there was no spring effect in that nitrate in 2022. I think. I also saw less nitrate leaching 2022 than 2021. So,
Yeah.
So I think it would be good to expand more the effects of weather for future publications. I don't know. As a reviewer, I'm going to ask you.
yeah,
Something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Excellent words.
Thank
A
you.
lot of effect.
Thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate that. And yeah, just kind of like a follow up to that, that's totally on point as well. And actually I think that more for the kind of like dissertation and publication side of things, that's where we're including more of that analysis. But that's a pretty fair point, then. For sure, again, it's kind of like the challenges, right, of having these two seasons. But again, I think that this sets the great, kind of like basis towards further experimentation and kind of like expanding and continue understanding how these Cura clover overall cover cropping systems work within the system. So yeah, but thank you for that. Yes, Dr. Wilson.
Question about practical
Yes.
things that you learned. You talked a few times about how now knowing what the nitrogen management looks like for the different rotations, what kind of, I think you said specifically, like, now we know what's happening, we can change our management practices. So like, what exactly are you suggesting that farmers should do to manage or kind of best management practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of like for the Zoom as well, it's kind of like the continuation of what other management practices, as I mentioned, we could suggest to farmers in order to kind of like benefit the overall functionality of these cover cropping systems. I think that one of the big ones, and there are a lot of opportunities in reality, like especially for Cura clover, it really tells us a lot that, again, these were only two for Cura clover. We only had 2 nitrogen rates. As for rye and no cover, we had the 5 nitrogen rates. So probably these opens the door to further experimentation, that there might be a point, kind of like experimenting with different nitrogen rates, that we might actually be able to hit that sweet spot, as Psych loves to say, where, we're able to actually provide sustainability in terms of production for the farmers. Some additional kind of like ideas that I had to, includes also the fact that maybe these Cura clover systems could also work kind of like in a foraging system as well. Kind of, you get the dual functionality of the environmental benefits, and you also provide a foraging opportunity. And that's a lot of what in different field days, kind of like farmers have been really interested in knowing a little bit more about, just because maybe it's true that there is a yield penalty on certain systems, but if you're able to provide an additional incentive, maybe it's actually, something really attractive for farmers as well. And kind of like last one as well for rye, I would say that one of the major limitations was the fact that, we are not able to put in that much biomass from rye. So maybe, extending a little bit more, delaying the termination, maybe green planting could be a potential to accumulating more biomass and making it more of a fair comparison, at least in terms of biomass. Thank you. And well, I think that I don't have questions from this. Yeah.
Other questions?
I can ask you the same one.
Yes,
I asked
Jake.
Zach not that long ago.
Yeah.
What do you think the ethos is in the area in terms of like farmers' receptiveness to best management practices and given this?
Yeah.
Do you think that people are pretty open in central Minnesota, same to make those changes? And there's probably no good answer in terms of like percentage of change. But comment on it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. And, I have been working with cover crops for a while now, and it's really impressive. I mean, I love cover crops, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, we know that adoption rates are still not that great, especially, talk even beyond the Midwest and Minnesota, just overall. in the US and in other regions. But overall, the susceptibility for farmers, at least, in every interaction that I had within the field days, is really open and kind of like trying to understand this more. For sure, right? Every time if you approach the farmer by saying words as yield penalty, you're going to scare them away. So maybe it's just about the way. For sure, we're not trying to kind of like make stuff up at the same time. But it's just like kind of like the approach and a lot of the things that I mentioned of maybe about the perception on how we are perceiving these yield penalties for Cura clover, for example. But on the other hand, as a general statement to answer your question, Jake, I would say that yes, the susceptibility, especially in these vulnerable soils, is pretty high whenever we talk, about the huge environmental impact that we can have, from these soils. But again, right, it's still not a widespread adoption, so it's a lot of kind of like a paradigm. If I were to answer it, put it in one single word. Thank you. Yes, Zach.
Is there any other rotation or cover crop you wish you could have studied?
Yeah. I would say that, it would be really interesting to kind of like, have additional cover crop species as well. Maybe, for example, even trying and venturing something like cover crop mixes. You might get probably an additional benefit. Yes, you might get one benefit from one species, but maybe by adding an additional species, you might have some complementarity as well that might be able to help towards the trade-offs that we're seeing agronomically and environmentally as well. And other rotations as well, it would be great to kind of like get the opportunity of trying that as well. As we discussed with Dr. Fernandez as well, it would be pretty cool again to see these in kind of like a forage type of like system. So yeah, definitely lots of ideas, but we'll know that more students are going to come in to keep testing those ideas, right? So thank you. Yes, Dr. Wilson.
How would you incorporate manure?
Ooh, great. That's a wonderful question. And by the way, added context to everyone. So now I am part of the manure team as well. So I think that that's definitely a question that I would expect. Something that I would think about probably, I would love to see kind of like manure injections, for example, kind of like coupled with these cover cropping systems, especially for the perennial Cura clover, to kind of like see how that reacts with the whole system. And then, as well, for example, when we think about dry cover crops, it would be really cool to see it, for example, with side dressing applications and see kind of like the interaction of the nitrogen immobilization from rye and see if that benefits the overall system whenever we add manure into the equation. For sure, lots of ideas that I am sure I'm going to get as we continue to work together. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Right. Well, thanks, Eduardo, for your presentation. And I could see the field group represented by Thor here is really excited about the manure doing manure. But as we can see, the questions continue, and that's a great thing. Again, I just want to wrap it up. Again, expressing appreciation to your work and as well as the funding. MDA has been a great partner in helping us with this project throughout all these years with Clean Water Funds, as well as the Polk County SWCD. So conservation district.
Well, Kim is actually online. Okay,
well,
thank you.
Good, yeah. So this is an example of something that can be done only when you have partners. It's impossible to really do a lot of this work unless you have partners that are fully committed. And so, with that, let's give Eduardo another hand.
Thank you, everyone, so much. I wanna try to.
Yeah, man.
There we go. Hi, Doug.
I'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone that actually made it. Muchas gracias a todos los que están aquí. Un fuerte abrazo. Bye.
De 10 personas llegó todo el mundo aquí.
Yes.